Okay.
Hello and welcome. This is Zeitgeist Melbourne Radio, a show in the series. We haven't done one in a while, but there's a whole lot waiting to come out of numerous discussions we've had on current events and ongoing issues. So I'm Sonny, that's Craig. We're two of the regulars at meetups. At least I try to be. Craig's regular.
I eat on my brain in the morning. I'm very regular.
So, Craig, we have a list. There's a plan of the 4-point. This is our platform.
It's that 4-point plan.
I can't read it. You can. But yes, we're here to discuss several major potentially globe-changing events, starting with the U.S. election.
No, the Oz election.
We want to start with the Oz election.
Start with the Oz election.
Okay.
So we should mention that we're part of the Zeitgeist Melbourne group, and you should watch the Zeitgeist movie series, 1, 2, and Moving Forward, or the original addendum and Moving Forward. They're available online, and we subscribe to those kind of ideals put forward in Moving Forward, and we like to talk about things from a geopolitical, economic, and Zeitgeistian stance. So we're going to start with the Oz election. Interesting election. Very interesting election. So just to wrap up, people who might not know, maybe from around the world, the Conservative Party had a big lead on what is considered our left before the election. They were in front by 25 seats or something. The Liberal National Coalition had a 25-seat jump on the Labor Party and the minor parties. There's been a lot of dissatisfaction with the previous leader of the Liberal National Coalition, a guy called Tony Abbott, and people, including on the political left and even mainstream and non-political left, thought that Malcolm Turnbull would be the new guy who's leading the party, who took control in the coup, would be a better option because he came out pro-climate change, pro-gay marriage at one point. Very rare for a Conservative politician.
So just to summarize, we have a very standard sort of following neoliberal economic model right-wing party that campaigns on the great threat of refugees. A few thousand that come to Australia in a year. They're the first major threat. The second major threat in this country, according to they're called liberal. They're the opposite of liberal, I think.
If the Australians have it backwards, it's important to note that when we talk about the Liberal Party, it's big L liberal.
Yeah.
Which actually means our Conservatives, more like the Republicans and the Tories.
It's like the Ministry of Truth.
And the Democrats or the...
It's an ode to George Orwell.
Yeah.
We're the Liberal Party. So they are basically, pro-corporate, anti-worker, anti-human, against whatever, any type of diversity, refugees, gay people, the general sort of right-wing conservative trend. And if anybody from the outside observers, anybody that's got a keen political eye, whatever, to pick one person from the Liberal Party that, he's not too bad, it would have been Malcolm Turnbull.
Yeah, because he came out, for things like gay marriage and climate change, or at least he believed...
He was one of the greatest anti-monarchy people in Australia. He was pro-Australia becoming a republic.
Well, the funny thing is I think people liked him because he had this moment where he crossed the floor.
Yeah.
So what that means in electoral politics in Australia is we actually sit on different sides in the parliament. I think they do that in a lot of countries, actually. And instead of voting with the party... I can't remember whether it was climate change or gay marriage, or I think it was climate change or the carbon tax. He literally crossed the floor. He went over and voted with the Labor Party, and it was quite a groundbreaking moment. And people thought, "Wow, this guy's really different, and maybe he's a bit more our speed, and he's not X, Y, and Z." He got control of the Liberal Party from the previous heavily conservative, religious, right-wing nutter, dare I say it, and.
But then just proceeded to carry on the exact same policies with the same vigor. I mean,
yes.
Completely abandoned whatever principles he had as an individual. So, you can't be an individual as a party member, but you cannot be an individual as a party leader. He's just literally embodying their platform, which is kind of sad and embarrassing. But I'll say one very good thing about our election. Evidently, I truly think that it was a fair election. Unlike America, we don't have voting machines that...
well, they're talking about it.
You know, we don't...
Did you see the article about that?
No, I didn't.
No, sorry, just interject there. They're talking about that now. So... again, we need to recap the elections. So the Conservatives were 25 seats in front. They had a clear majority. Labor, or our political left, which is very centrist, compared to actual politics.
It's only to the left of the right-wing party.
Yes.
That's the sense in which they're left.
Most definitely.
In most European countries, they would be the right-wing party. Like, it would be
they'd
exactly
be conservative
the same.
centrist, yeah.
Yeah.
But, they were 25 seats behind, and they were completely decimated, the Labor Party, last election. And they came back with a screaming force this time. They won 12 of those seats back, and the Liberal National Coalition, the aforementioned Conservative Party, has attained what looks like the slimmest of majorities to govern. It's still actually potentially a hung parliament, but at the moment it looks like they're going to get just over the line. So they were decimated, and Labor have come back. But what I was getting at before was they're thinking about going electronic. So there was this big hoo-ha.
Oh, hell no.
There was this big hoo-ha about the fact that it's been 2 weeks since the election and we haven't got a clear result yet. We're still waiting on votes to be counted manually, paper votes, because we do paper voting here. And both the Labor and the Liberal Party came out and said we have to go to e-voting. Now, that's quite worrying for me, given what's happened in the American election.
Look, there can be there's been an analysis, for example, with Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton, right? He's been consistently trailing the actual votes have consistently trailed the exit polls by up to 15%, above 5 every single time. So that's never happened in any election ever covered in history in any Western country where, we consider there to be fair elections. There's never been such a consistent and wide discrepancy between exit polling and the final results.
I'm just going to pause you there for a minute. So that's completely correct. And the funny thing is that the US State Department uses exit polls from elections as a guide to get a general feel for if the elections are fair. And if they don't feel they're fair, they intervene or they question it. And the percentage they use is 2%.
Right.
So if you're holding an election in Venezuela or South Africa or some Argentinian country where they're monitoring you and your exit polls are more than 2% out of your counted vote, the American State Department will try and intervene or will question the election or will call you illegitimate.
OSCE, International Election Observer.
But some of their polls from Hillary versus Sanders, which is the primary election in the Democratic race, have been up to 15 points out, which is a huge discrepancy. And there was a Stanford study that said Hillary did better and exit polls were more out in states with no accountable paper record of the electronic voting. So where you were more likely to cheat, Hillary did way better. When you were less likely to cheat, when there were easily verifiable paper printout results of the election, there was, in theory, what the Stanford study is saying is less fraud. So clearly, e-voting has its problems. If we went that way, there would have to be huge checks and balances.
You've got to realize how much is at stake when you're having an election. We're talking about probably hundreds of billions of dollars. Like that election in America influences 1 billion people in the world and every single major corporation around the planet. So you have so many powerful stakeholders that want one candidate over another. So many reasons to rig it.
Yep.
And this can be done covertly. You don't need, I presume if they're going to collate these results from all these election machines, those machines are going to have IP addresses. They're going to send data, at least. But everything that sends data more or less also receives data, and everything that sends and receives data can be hacked by hackers. And, if you want a guarantee that something actually exists, like a record of something that actually happened. For instance, if you're creating a footage of an event, you're going to have it on a physical copy that cannot be edited, stored somewhere. But data from these machines, I mean, the only reason, we think our bank accounts are safe is because there's not enough money in those bank accounts. If you just follow something like credit card fraud, banks have endless budgets to prevent bank fraud and credit card fraud. And it happens at a tune of multiple billions of dollars a year. Mm-hmm. So the most secure systems for information, for money in accounts, aren't actually totally secure. Bitcoin, which is the most heavily encrypted thing we've ever come up with, before a number of scandals, they thought that nobody can steal your Bitcoins. It's theoretically impossible, mathematically certain. Simply digital data and information in terms of digital data is corruptible, modifiable. It's not inherently safe. You want to have normal, safe elections, you should just vote on paper, end of story. No election held by e-voting can actually guarantee that those were the actual results.
And legitimate. But the interesting thing for me is why it's a problem. So if we think for a minute about elections and about the amount of time and effort it goes into them, it's almost a kind of an instant gratification thing. Like, we want to know immediately who won. And because we want to know immediately who won, because the country doesn't need to be in uncertainty, whatever that means.
The last winners are still in charge until we know. Not exactly what's the big deal
exactly
with
right.
that?
But because we need to know, because the argument runs down the idea that we need to know straight away, well, we're kind of willing to sacrifice that legitimacy of proper paper votes you can see and verify and count. And I think that's going to require a change on our point of view. We have to say, actually, you know what? We're okay with the uncertainty for a month.
Yeah.
Leave the last guy in power for a month until we know what's going on. Because I'd rather, and I think it's better, to rather have that uncertainty for a month than have someone still in power who's been in power for 3 years anyway, to make sure the paper votes can be counted. Because that way you're going to get a lot less, the likelihood of fraud is a lot less. There's been some scandals in the AEC. There's been 4 or 5.
Let me just ask you, so what do you think would happen?
Sure.
If in America, I don't know, there's an election and Jill Stein wins by a landslide, there would be FBI investigations, right, left, center. They'd find some fraud, somebody who cheated for Jill Stein on some machine. The establishment candidates, people, when you look at reality shifts, it's much easier to sell that the status quo hasn't changed and something radical has happened. So what I'm saying, if there's 2 major parties in power,
mm-hmm.
An election which results in one of them winning is something we can all accept. Generally speaking, that's what we expect.
Yeah, but we can't accept the insurgent candidate or a different party.
Exactly. And if, in a way, it's almost a double insurance policy that one day, if an insurgent candidate does win, they can blame it on the voting machines that are electronic. But if the, status quo continues to win, then
it's validated.
It's validated.
Well, the funny thing is, I think you were touching on the next point, which is that the people that advocated for e-voting were the Labor and Liberal Party, the 2 major parties in Australia.
And
the Conservative
guys,
right and the less Conservative right.
For those of you not in Australia, I imagine 90% of you will be, but there is no major difference between these 2 parties. I mean, Australia's, in a way, one positive thing is that historically there has hardly ever been any major shift due to an election. We've had things like GST and Medicare introduced, and this was all revolutionary in the Keating and what's the name of the Hawke and Keating governments in the.
What are you referring to?
Major changes in terms of the way this country's run.
I think that would probably be from Menzies and Whitlam, and then Keating and Hawke continued some of that, yeah.
Okay. So, I'm not that familiar with Australian history, but you can kind of, in the last 50 years, name 3 or 4 things. Like GST, like Medicare, that have had an impact on our lives that we felt.
And free education at one point during the Whitlam years, yeah. Like, there's definitely stuff that's been... Look...
But with the late,
Yeah.
What major shift, other than the NBN, like, that's the biggest thing I can think of, is the NBN. That
well, this is the funny thing.
One party would do and the other wouldn't.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you here, because I think the two parties are very aligned. They're very centrist right parties, and one is slightly further right than the other. And that's what we have. I don't doubt it. But it also mattered, because the long-term project of the Conservatives is, like, if you look at documents and statements from multiple Conservative governments and leaders in the last 20 years, their goal has been to dismantle universal healthcare, our universal healthcare system, to deregulate university fees because they want to corporatise or privatise the structures. So while I agree that the Labor Party is not a left party anymore, it's not truly worker representative. They do, it's kind of, and I'm going to come back to Clinton here for a minute. She is more progressive on a lot of issues than Trump. And the same with the Labor Party and Liberals. They are further left. And you have to recognise that in terms of at least holding a line for things like universal healthcare and regulated university fees and union rights, things like that. I don't think the Democrats or the Labor Party in Australia, Democrats in the US, are revolutionary parties. You're right. They were at one time. Like if you look at the history of the Labor Party, you'll find that they rose up out of the unions in the 20s and 30s. In the early 1900s, they were a representative party. They were definitely very left, and they had a hard time getting into government for a long time. And Menzies ruled for 4 terms or something. Conservative politician in the 40s and 50s and 60s, I think. But what you see this kind of shift toward a centrist policy regime of the Labor Party, but they're still a little bit further left. So I get why people are disaffected by it, and we'll talk about this later.
Yep.
But I don't agree with the fact that they're the same. They're not quite the same. They're similar. There's
something that sort of sickens me.
What's
that the way they, in Australia, you have, when you vote, you sort of number your candidates, and then most people actually don't number their candidates. They just go with the preference of the parties for that particular seat.
Mm-hmm.
And the two major parties generally prefer each other over any serious independent candidates.
Well, hang on, I'm going to pull you up there. So that was an issue this time around as well. But that hasn't been an issue in the past. So let me give you the example. So every time we have an election, there's a big hoo-ha about who's preferencing who. With a preferential voting system, if your first preference doesn't get in, if you vote Green or Nick Xenophon or some other party, and it's not one of the two majors competing for the seat, your preferences then go to your number 2 or number 3 preference. So you number your preferences from 1 to 7 or whatever it is, and your second preference then, if your first preference isn't anywhere near the top, gets, and they go down your preference list to give you to one of the two majors so they can figure out, which is why we have what's called first vote counts or primary vote counts, and then we have preference vote counts, and people in Australia win on preferences.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the seat of Batman right now, which is a seat down, I think, south of the river, the Green Party candidate won the primary vote. But it was a big deal because the Labor and Liberal Party normally don't preference each other over their more extreme versions of themselves. Like the Green Party is further left than the Labor Party. They normally work together. In that seat, the Liberal Party preferenced Labor over other people so that the Labor Party could keep out the Greens candidate. So the Green candidate won more primary votes. She's ahead by 0.5% in the primary vote count. But she's down in the after preference counts because the Labor guy got so many Liberal preferences because he's nowhere near the top. So they don't normally preference each other. Like, I need to make that clear. The fact that they did this time was a big deal, and it was all over the news. And the original hoo-ha was that the Greens were doing it. The Greens were making backdoor deals with the Liberal Party, the bad guys. Turns out that was baloney.
Yeah.
and it was the Labor Party that were doing that. They were saying, if you give us preferences here so we can keep out the Greens candidate, we'll give you preferences at these marginal seats to keep out your
further right-wing
candidates. So that was a big deal. So again, I want to be factual and correct here when we talk about this stuff. So it's a really interesting space because I think that those elections and those moments matter. And there's definitely a change or a difference in the two parties, but they are two centrist parties. We haven't had anywhere near a socialist or a workers' party or an anarchist party anywhere near power for a long time.
I just want to say that, like, having lived in Australia now for, 14 years, I've never really felt a political change affect my life. Like, nothing has happened. The closest thing I've ever seen to, like, the decision of this party is going to affect my life was the NBN that Labour started putting in, and it was really exciting that we're finally going to catch up with the internet speeds of the rest of the world.
No, you're right about that. Like, you're totally right about that. But then you can ask why that is. So you can have that conversation. So why is it that even when we have a conservative government like John Howard or Tony Abbott, we don't see a lot of change in the structure? It's because I think, just like in the UK, not so much in the US, but just like in the UK, there's so much of an acceptance of this centrist idea that universal healthcare is off limits.
Yep. That
university education paid for largely by the government is off limits. You can't stuff with this stuff because you won't, like, the voter backlash will be so intense because we're so used to it. And this is the argument you see when you listen to the Democrats.
We've also got fucking feudalistic style property laws are off limits too.
But
you know, we have some very right wing and some left wing policies that are both of the limits, and perhaps there's like a large consensus on very important issues of both parties that they don't mess with.
No, I'm agreeing with that, but I think that's because of the voter backlash. So I think that there's a certain level of acceptance that we don't go beyond the pale in some of these points. And, you know, the big deal about Tony Abbott trying to freeze doctors' rebates. So when you go to the doctor in Australia, it's a Medicare system where you go and you show your Medicare card, you get a consult. It's probably free if you've got
the state pays the doctor $150 an hour. I know because my sister's a doctor. So.
Exactly right. So you don't pay anything for that except when you have what's called the gap. So some doctors charge the gap, but most doctors don't. So you can get what's called bulk billing, and you don't worry about it. And the idea that rebate would be frozen, so that at some point you would have to start paying more of a gap every time was so much of a hot button issue that it couldn't get through a hung Senate, and even had trouble going through the lower house that was controlled by the Conservatives. So there's almost like, and this is the argument that the Democrats and Republicans in the States always have, you know, like the idea that some of the Conservatives in the States in the US were putting forward was that if you give the people healthcare like they did with the Obamacare, which was essentially a private mandate, so as an individual you were forced to buy a private plan, but because the government was negotiating on your behalf, you got it way cheaper than what they would charge you individually. So it was a bulk billing version of a private system. Because of that, Conservatives were arguing that as soon as you give people this, they're going to like it, and they're going to go, it's actually not good enough, I want the next step.
Yeah.
Because people get used to having things, and if you try to take them away from them, it's such a big deal.
I mean,
so this is why the Conservatives and the right in the States are holding so much of a line. They don't want to inch a step to the left because they know that when you do, you're going to lose that inch, and then you've got to start giving the mile.
You know, there is an infinite scope for debate whether left-wing policies are efficient or bang for buck, or, you know, there's a lot of accusations of sort of bureaucratic and administrative waste, but there is absolutely no sane person that can argue that universal education, universal healthcare is not in the public interest.
But the funny thing is they do from the point of view of economics, but what they lose out on is the point you made before that. So when you said that there's bureaucratic costs involved, the problem with that is that that's not actually the case. So again, I'm going to use the American context here for a minute.
Well, is it like it's open to debate? I mean, I'm pretty damn sure that there is a huge number of public services that you can name that are more bang for buck efficient than private competition. But, you see, that is something that is in the range of things that can be debated. For example, if the country decides like, oh, we're going to have freaking a touch on, like Mikey, for instance. Yeah, it's paid for by the government, an infrastructure that the train companies are going to use, and the costs blow out, and the costs blow out, and the costs blow out. And if we just had train companies competing, or if we had, sold bits of the rail network, then the private industry would have had to handle that problem, and they probably wouldn't have blown out the cost so much unless that the taxpayer was footing the bill. Like, issues like that get brought up again and again every time something goes wrong.
Well, let's have a talk about that.
Because it plays in to the right-wing ideology of government being inefficient. And all I'm saying is, though, even if you accept that, public services and government-provided services are inefficient, you go, wait a second, corporate welfare that's going to go offshore that you're never going to see, or money inefficiently spent on you. Like, how's that even a choice? Like, even if you accept the argument of inefficiency, you're still way ahead on having your tax money being spent on services for you and people like you, rather than literally being given off to banks and corporations in corporate welfare. Corporations receive more welfare than pensioners and unemployed people by a factor of, I don't even know, in America it was like 12 over the last, since 2008.
So let me try and unpack some of those points for a minute.
Yes.
Because I think you went across 3 or 4, but I'll start with one and then we'll go on to the next and I think the third. So what I think you're saying is, even if you accept the government bureaucracy argument that is more expensive,
that's it.
I'd still rather have my tax dollars spent for us rather than going to a private company to make profit off things like healthcare and transport.
Absolutely.
Right. First thing, if we look at the American system, if we look at some examples from the American system, and again, I use that system primarily as an example, 1, because I watch it and keep track of it a lot, and 2, because it has the clearest demarcation between market and government in one system that we have at the moment to use as an example. The Australian system is largely a welfare state system, so is the UK. The American system has welfare state aspects, but it also has a lot of private provider aspects that provide public services.
Well, US history itself has gone from, under Roosevelt and the New Deal being sort of the ultimate global welfare state to under Reagan being the absolute opposite.
Well, it's important to note that Roosevelt didn't put in some of these programs. Like, some of these programs were written in by LBJ.
Right.
Lyndon Baines Johnson, who put in things like Medicare, and he signed the Civil Rights Act. So there was a Democratic president after Kennedy's VP, and he did a lot of that stuff. Roosevelt did a lot of public works and government infrastructure spending, which is Keynesian economics 101, where if you're in deficit, the government can provide jobs to build projects that benefit businesses, etc., etc. But getting back to my point,
fundamentally, nobody in America spent tens of billions of dollars on infrastructure, which is basically the circulation system of the body, if the body were to be an economy.
Yeah.
Nobody's done that since Roosevelt.
But again, let's look at the example for a minute and let's use healthcare as an example.
Yeah.
So they actually have Medicare over there. But Medicare for 65 and above, or 67, there's an age where they say you're a pensioner, you're retired, and now the government's going to look after you. The overhead for that program is 3%. That's the bureaucratic expense of the government running that program. The overhead, 3%, that's it. And they get really good drug prices because they negotiate for the whole country, so they get this drug per the ton, you know what I mean? Like, it's a better system. If you look at private healthcare, the overheads of Blue Cross and these private companies that provide healthcare to everyone else who's not 65 and over is something like 20%.
Well, yeah.
Because there's a profit structure, there's administrative costs. So that argument, when it comes down to certain things, which is getting back to the points we were making before, doesn't really work. What they're saying is, do you want government building your iPhone? Probably not. Perhaps not even your car. But do you want government providing vital lifeblood services like healthcare, transport, bridge maintenance, things like that? That makes no sense to have a competitive market in.
Well, you're right, because...
So this is where those arguments start to merge. So it's not that all government's bureaucratic and expensive, although that's what the right wants you to think, because they use the iPhone and market arguments that, like if the government made all your clothes, you'd all be wearing grey and marching to work like rats in a maze, and you'd all be slaves. And this is what would happen if the government made your shirts.
In colourful clothes. Like, what the fuck are you talking
exactly
about?
Right. Yeah. But they use that example and they spread it across to healthcare and transport, to those other things. Whereas you can easily say, I'm okay with the market for some things, like cars, iPhones, clothes, music, video games, art. I'm not okay with the market for healthcare, transport, infrastructure, electrical services. So, coming back to an example you gave before...
I would even say government needs to take a bigger part in drugs, pharmaceuticals, and medical research. Because we live in a sort of paradoxical age where things that are meant to extend our lives, keep us healthy, right? They need to make a profit. So there's certain drugs, treatments, every kind of medical...
Yeah.
Right. So in order for them to come to being, they need to be profitable at a conceptual stage.
No. I don't agree with that.
No, but that's a system we live with.
That's the system we currently live in, yes. And that's why we want to extend our patents via these trade deals to intellectual property so companies can make money off drugs, etc.
And so, technically speaking, like whether a certain amount of herb or a certain balance in your diet could dramatically extend life or change things, or I don't know, a certain amount of we don't even get to find out. Because the only thing that is studied to sufficient detail to pass the sort of medical treatment threshold, it costs $20 million to find out if substance A, whatever the fuck this is, maybe cucumber powder, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
If it has beneficial health effects, even that, a study that would say yes on average or no on average, costs something like $20 million. So this only happens for patentable chemicals. Well, and in other words, if you can think of the realm of what human beings can do to drastically change or improve their health, some of the most successful results are produced in people who follow freaking blogs, which is so bizarre in a system we live in, because the smartest people, the billions of dollars, are engaged in pursuing this range of possibilities, this narrow range of possibilities of helping us and treating us with patentable pharmaceutical chemicals. Because anything else isn't fitting within that. Nobody's going to make billions of dollars, so why would anybody invest tens of millions into finding out if something has positive health effects? In other words, I think government should be much more involved. A non-profit institutions should be much more involved in general well-being and healthcare of people in Western countries. That was...
All right, so the interesting thing is you're making an argument for government involvement and against government involvement at the same time. That statement. So
I'm sure that aspects of it,
profit making in the healthcare industry, is potentially dangerous, and probably is dangerous right now, because there's a general belief that there's no profit in curing cancer. There's profit in maintaining life while you have cancer.
That's not a general belief. It's a state of affairs at the moment.
No, but the funny thing is we have no proof of that, but that's the motive. And the reason for
that's
that
the economics of cancer.
But this is what I'm getting at. The economics dictate that it's smarter to run a patent out as far as you can, make as much money off that particular drug which extends life with people with this condition for as long as you can before you give the next one or before you cure it, because you run out the clock. So it's the same idea that says we'll get the electric car and we'll get fully electric grid systems and all that stuff the minute the last drop of oil is burnt. Yeah. It's gone, and here we go, here's your new society. Sorry it took so long. Because... And the funny thing is, in a competitive market, that makes sense. It's a rational thought. It's the rational thought of the irrational market. And the reason for that is because if I'm not digging up the oil and burning it for petrol, someone else will. So they're going to make the money and I'm going to miss out while I'm trying to get electric cars off the ground over here, for example. So the problem with that is many. But the other side of the argument, if I take it from a right-wing point of view for a minute, the reason we don't have cucumber cures, or we don't know the basic tenets of, proper nutrition and health as well-being, rather than health as cure for the problem, is because, like, you talk for about $20 million for this study.
Yeah.
That becomes a barrier to entry.
It does, it is.
For people who want to say, I'd love to test the effects of monkey saliva on a particular hep C virus or whatever it is, right? So I've got this idea. I've seen the results based on treating my friends, and I'd like to put this forward for a study. But that costs $20 million, and I can't afford that, so it's not going to happen. So that becomes a barrier to entry.
But, you see, here's the thing. No sane person suggesting we'll be testing monkey saliva or what did I make up? Cucumber powder. Because, the people that are immunologists, scientists, researchers, they gather up and go to conferences, and then anybody in the field can, without too much controversy, say, well, these are the sort of top 10, top 20 promising ideas in what may be the most efficient. I mean, we do have something of a set of standards by which these things are measured, and then professionals in the fields work on them. So it won't, you know what I mean? Like, the only thing that I suggest should change isn't the high stringent standards that we have in the medical field for something to be recognized as not a cure, but a valid treatment. It's actually for the range of what gets tested to expand to whatever we think is going to work, most likely.
Well, the funny thing is I don't know what the reason for that is. And I say that because I think there probably are people out there in the universities and the places of studying and stuff who probably look at some of those. I've got no doubt if you went, and I don't know the history, but I've got no doubt if you went through the history of medical breakthroughs, you would find a whole bunch of, like, for example, scurvy and vitamin C.
Perhaps you could say the low-lying fruit has more or less been picked, but...
No, but what I'm saying is I don't know why they're not doing that. Perhaps they are and we don't know. Perhaps we don't know.
One thing that I sort of know from secondhand experience with people that work in it, is that most medical trials, vast majority, 90% plus, are privately funded by corporations, and they're not ever going to fund anything that's not
beneficial or
patentable, that they can't make cash on. So, which, that's, you don't need to think at a deeper level about it. That already indicates a problem. Sort of an artificial scarcity, an artificial limitation to what we can investigate.
Yes.
If someone said, you know what, we're only going to investigate planes on batteries. Fuck it. We would not be flying people across the Atlantic if batteries were the inherent limitation that planes have to use batteries. There's no reason if the endeavor is to cure people, to make them healthier, to limit the potential tools that you're going to use in a quest to do that.
Except for what's patentable and what's not.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think there's an element to that. But I also think the idea that you could eat a food or you could do something that's quite simple based on natural products, if there is a cure there, would frustrate large companies who want to medicalize and sell you drugs based on X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to go into. I mean, like here's
a genius example, right? Yeah. THC, the actual active ingredient in marijuana. If you Google it, there's been multiple corporate-funded studies to see if that has beneficial effects. Mm-hmm. They failed. The reason why is because that's something they could isolate, that's something that they could synthesize, that's something that they could patent. So they literally looked at all these people claiming to be cured by marijuana, going like, maybe there's a buck in it. Is there a compound in there? Like, what's the most promising one? Yeah, we can patent this one. So they actually look at natural remedies and natural cures, and they ask themselves the question, is there something here we can patent? And then they test that thing. So that the notion that, there's nothing promising in natural medicine, there's plenty. But again, even that is being looked at through a very, 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 very narrow, unnecessarily narrow lens. But I want to move on.
Yeah. Well, but again, I think we're in agreement there. I think the interesting part about that is it's difficult to put something like that in place and make profit off it.
Yeah.
And so it's much better to keep it complicated, keep it scientific, keep it based on X, Y, and Z drug and doing this and that, because that's something they know and they are used to, and that's something they keep going forward with and keep having results from. So they keep selling drugs based on that, and there seems to be a legitimate course for them forward, rather than looking at what might be considered the hippie cures or the natural or that kind of thing. And
even like
I don't necessarily think naturopathy and fields like that are invalid or valid. I don't have an opinion on those, but I know that the studies haven't been done, I don't think. And if they have, they've been limited in scope. So there's potentially stuff there we could be exploring, but it doesn't fit the model of what we think about as medicine.
And, if somebody threw a couple $1 billion at natural cures, we would in 5 years find out, oh my God, there's like 2% of what we looked at has real beneficial effects. Mm. And we changed the world for the better, but we do,
again, we're speculating there. Let's be clear about that.
I think they're maintaining the sort of aura of quackiness, and I think it's much like economics, much like trickle-down economics, which has been institutionalized and is being taught at universities, despite really all deeper analysis of the phenomenon suggesting that it doesn't work, that it's bullshit. Trickle-down economics is bullshit. Yet it's being taught at unis while people admit that it's bullshit. Functional medicine, which is the idea that doctors try to take people off of a ton of medication and help them through diet and exercise and nutrition, that's being seen and labeled as quackery. I mean, it's a bit... it's more than just economic incentives. Leading to companies doing certain acts. Well, it is economic incentives leading to propaganda to rationalize those incentives as being more common sense than they really are. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes, I don't. What I would like to see is genuine evidence of that before I accepted that conclusion. But I get the point and I understand what you're saying. But let's get back to, because we're
US politics.
We got way off track as usual. We were talking about the idea that the state and market and right-wing and left-wing stuff. Let's touch on the Australian election. Let's try and finish that off, and then we'll go on to the US election. So the Australian election, back to it. There was a rise in right and left parties that are more extreme than the two centrist parties. Why is that, Sonny? What do you think? Because we had a definite, even though the Greens lost a couple of Senate seats, for those who don't know or might be listening overseas, the Greens have held quite a few seats in the upper house of Parliament here, the Senate, for a couple of years. They lost a couple this time. They held on to their lower house seat, Adam Bant in Melbourne.
He's the guy here, right here, where I live.
He's pretty awesome. He actually gained votes, So he widened his margin, which is wonderful. And they almost took another 2 or 3 seats, but they didn't quite get there this time. So why did we have this disaffection with the two major parties? So
Shit's
what do you
fucked. So look, man, I think anybody who looks at politics, more than 1 week a year leading up to the election and looking at, pretty pictures and Twitter accounts of politicians, anybody who's, having any sense of analysis is going to realize that we're being told rhetoric by the major parties that is diametrically opposed to the reality.
So why do you think that is?
Why do I think that is?
So why do you think what the parties say is actually not representative of what they do? Which is what I think you just said.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, there's the pragmatic reason, and then there is the sort of more nefarious reason. The pragmatic reason
It's the pragmatic one, yeah.
Let's
assume the best for a minute.
The pragmatic reason is simply that the public don't respond well to complex, intricate analysis of any issue. They like simple realities, a very simple narrative. They either, even on the right and the left, for example.
So how does that equate to them not delivering on what they say?
Because the world isn't simple, and then, the reality in which politics functions doesn't follow simple narratives. I mean, right now, most people in this country either see refugees as, people with violent tendencies and crazy religious ideas that want to take their jobs and want to turn this country into Sharia law. There's that vision. And there's like a freaking saintly vision of refugees being, kind people who are going to seize the opportunity, make this country infinitely better, and we should let them all in. The practical reality, though, is that we live in a country with 23 million people. There is 1 billion people living in inhumane, vastly disadvantaged conditions. There's been a series of wars which never ends. At least the number of potential valid refugee candidates that could come to this country is running in probably hundreds of millions, but at least tens. So we already have, 100 legitimate refugees for anybody we could systematically house and adapt into Australia. So we're going to have to keep people out just by the mathematical reality of the situation. Now, if you're on the left, not letting all the refugees in is an act of xenophobia. If you're on the right, letting, 100,000 in 1 year that we could comfortably accommodate is a betrayal of our original Christian Australian values and blah, 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 commitment towards Sharia law. Again, two ideas on one issue that are separated from reality. So you have two parties generally picking a cartoonish version. Either refugees are bad or refugees are our moral duty that we can get all of them in. Like that. Global warming is the same thing.
Well, let's unpack the first one for a minute. So what's happening there? I actually think you didn't really give a clear vision of the left and the right of the issue, even in terms of mainstream politics. So
no, but I gave you what I'm saying is, if you listen to the news, you're going to hear two narratives if you follow to their logical conclusion, you're either going to be committing to fascism or you're going to be committing to an act of generosity, which is not only impossible, but insanely practically out of the realm of what we can do.
Well, hang on a sec. So, yes, but that's because the media is essentially slanted to the right. So what you gave there was the right-wing version of both ideas, rather than giving what's actually the left and what's actually the right.
Oh, please. Please.
So what you said there was the right wing is xenophobic and says that we have to maintain Australian values and we have to avoid the Islamization of the country because they're going to come over and they're going to make Sharia law and they're murderers and rapists. The Mexicans are rapists, etc. Right?
Right.
A la Trump. And they're welfare cheats. Like, that's the thing that they love trotting out. Like, the people are going to come here and they're going to sit on their...
Just read the Herald Sun and you will see it in an even more blunt version than how I represented him. It's not a misrepresentation.
No, of course, like, you're bang on the money. But what you also gave was the Herald Sun of the left, vision of the left, which is the Greens want to let everyone in and we should all give everyone hugs. But the funny thing is that that's not what they believe, and this is the problem with the...
I've spent hours and hours of talking to socialist alternative protesters of the refugee camps and so on.
But Sonny, hang on, let me finish that point for a minute. So, what you said there was the Herald Sun vision of the left and the right, but that's not actually the case. The Greens don't want to let everyone in without checks and balances. There's no party in the country that I know of, major or minor, that says we should open our doors with no checks and no balances. We should process refugees. We should check for criminal activity. We should make sure they're legitimate asylum seekers. But the Greens say we should do it onshore. We should do it here. It should be a fast process. And then when they're proven to be refugees, legitimately, we should then let them into society.
But you don't I don't think even, maybe you misunderstood me. There are, just in between, if you go from Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Turkey, with the Kurds, then you go Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan. Just going from there to there, inside that crescent, you will find 100 million legitimate refugees. There is no shortage of completely legitimate refugees that by all rights, if should be better off here than anywhere than where they are, that would contribute, that would make this country a better place. There is just more than can be practically accommodated. It's not a question of are they legitimate. There is an infinite abundance of legitimate refugees. Yeah. And
I did get that, yeah. But I'm just saying that the political parties don't assume what you were saying that they did. Now, I agree with that statement.
Even when you hear the Greens argue, they're saying we should guarantee that they're legitimate, we should do it onshore. But wait a second, you're not addressing the fact that the amount of legitimate refugees is mind-blowingly large. And you're not addressing, again, the fact of why, which I think is the biggest thing that we should act on, to make it a world without 1 billion legitimate refugees. But please, I don't know, where else did I mischaracterize the left position?
No, what you didn't mischaracterize it, what you did was give the Herald Sun vision of the left-wing vision. Which is slanted to the right.
Mischaracterization. By definition, I'm sorry.
It is, but it's also because our media is soaked in that narrative. Yeah. It's, we have a right-slanted media, and we can't help that. We have a left media, but it's very underground, or it's very not circulated. We don't have a centrist media, really. We have, again, just like our politics, our media reflects our politics, or our politics reflects our media, depending on where you see that causality. But getting back to what you were saying. So, there is hundreds of millions of legitimate refugees in Europe right now, and Turkey is taking the bulk of them. So is Lebanon, I think. They're taking a lot of them.
Turkey's taking more than the entirety of Europe.
Exactly right. But that's not what we're talking about. Because the funny thing is, it's not like there's a central processing agency that says, well, this country can take this amount of thousands, so we're going to ship 10 million over to Australia because they've got the big landmass. That's not what's happening. What's happening is we're seeing a few thousand people rock up on boats, and both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are saying, no, we don't even want to process them offshore in inhumane conditions. We want to turn the boats around. We want to stop these evil people smugglers. And the Greens are saying offshore processing is inhumane, and that's why we have children who are disturbed and psychologically affected, and we have people committing suicide in those camps on Manus and Christmas Island, etc. And they say, the people who come here by boat, we should take them in, and we should sit them in a processing facility until such time as they can be processed. Yeah. If you're found to be a legitimate refugee, then hell, yeah, we'll
But man,
set you up.
I've got no solution to that problem.
But there is a solution, because we're not talking about tens of millions of people from Indonesia. That's what I'm talking about. We're talking about there's not tens of millions of people coming by boat. That is the right wing view. It's 20,000 a year, maybe, and we have a landmass the size of America and a population a tenth of the size. So it's important to know that people actually create money. They help the economy.
Yeah.
They're not going to be drains. And look, I actually work in a school in the southeast of Melbourne, which has got a heavy refugee and migrant population. They don't qualify for all these payments. They're not welfare cheats. They can't just come here and jump on the dole. It doesn't happen that way.
Yeah.
There's so much crap they have to go through to get any kind of government assistance before they can, they can't go to uni. Like, I have a lot of international and refugee students who don't get the same benefits as I do as an Australian citizen when you sign up for uni. Like, it just doesn't. That's what I'm talking about. That's that kind of media slant.
Right.
That's that media slant. It doesn't happen that way. So honestly, I think those narratives are the narratives peddled by that centrist right media, and they're not actually legitimate.
Look, given the practicality,
look at Turkey. They're dealing with the refugees.
No. You're given the practicality of where the hotspots in the world are today and right now.
Not around us.
Are not around us. No. And, the onshore processing argument. See, no, I'm going to concede that you're absolutely right on this issue. But I would also add right for now. Because, I would, if in doubt, do the right thing. And if then the consequences of doing the morally right thing become too grave 5-10 years down the track, you can revisit it, but you at least have the duty to try it. As far as I know, when we shortened the stay on the island or did some onshore processing, et cetera, there was a slight increase in the boats, nothing that we couldn't manage, maintain. And then this slight increase itself was played off as something much, much, much larger.
Crazy. Oh my God, what's happening there invading our country?
But quite simply, if that policy that you just said was in play and the global conflict zone was in Southeast Asia as opposed to, North, West Africa and the Middle East, no. Like, what the right-wing position would actually be much, much closer to reality than it is right now. But you're right. And I completely agree with that position. I'll add a caveat for now. When in doubt, try to do the right thing. And
well, it's interesting because that's going to take us on to our next topic. And we've been speaking for an hour, so we need to get on to our next topic.
Yes.
Brexit and the EU.
I want to talk about the US.
I'm going to come back to terrorism and some privilege stuff as well.
I want to throw in a few thoughts on Brexit.
Of course, but we're going to go into Brexit because I think that's relevant for the refugee crisis right now. But I'm going to first give you a couple of points, maybe,
yeah, sure.
And then you give me a couple of points, and we'll try and unpack them as we go. So I'm ambivalent about the whole thing. There's a part of me that didn't want it because I'm a British citizen, and now I've lost my European citizenship, which was just it's damn annoying. There's a part of me that was against it because I think Britain in that circle of nations could deal with things like refugees. The problem with that statement was that they want it. They were just still cutting people off at the border, like, the border in France. I was pro-Brexit because I think that the European Union and Commission creates a set of laws and economics that actually makes entry to the market difficult. So even though the European market became easier to access for your other European countries, it wasn't so much that it became easier to access through European countries and companies. It was that European corporations who can deal with regulation that the EU was putting out can make life easy for themselves, and anyone coming up through the ranks finds it difficult to comply with everything. So the EU regulations and central economics system that they have, the ECB and the European Commission, make it difficult for smaller companies to break through on people like Apple and Samsung and larger food companies that can afford to comply with every single regulation that comes down based on food standards and how straight a banana would be and this kind of stuff. So I was pro and for it at the same time. But I heard a really interesting argument, and I think there's something to this, that it's funny how we really want to make it easy to do business overseas. We really want to make it easy, in this example, for British car companies to sell cars in Germany. So the European structure in the euro was an easy way to do that, to make, Rolls-Royce and Lotus and those English companies make it. I'm not sure if Lotus is an English company.
Aston Martin, whatever.
To sell cars in Europe. But we want to make it super difficult for people who don't have the right papers to move countries.
Yeah.
And this is going to bring me back to our context.
Well, look, fundamentally...
hang on, let me just quickly... I don't even care. Let's just say we have a bunch of refugees who rock up here in a boat. And it's found that they don't even have legitimate refugee status. They're not criminals. They're not people who
want a better life for their kids.
Yeah, they just want a better shot. I don't care about that, because I think people should be mobile, because if transnational capital can be mobile...
Yeah.
Then people should be mobile too, and that's the way to balance that system out, or at least make it better. But the problem is that if you keep people in the country, but make the companies transnational, you can create low-wage enclaves, etc., etc. So I think
I agree with you.
So I don't have a problem if he wants to come here and he's not criminal, he wants to set up a house and start a shop in Brunswick, totally okay with that.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, I will be the first to admit, though, we'll suffer economically in the short term if people were mobile. I mean, this is an island of wealth, even though it's systematically unjust. There's an abundance of wealth here that, allows people like you and me to turn our hobbies into jobs and do all right.
Sure.
And if, that wouldn't be possible if the economics of the world was distributed such that there was never a place where there's a lot of money and a few people.
No, well, see, this is the thing. I don't necessarily... I get that point.
If people are mobile and money's mobile, people are going to follow the money, and the ratio of money to people is going to, on average, equalize around the world. I think this is just normal common sense. It's hard to argue again. But anyway, please...
Let me flip the script there. If people are mobile and capital is mobile...
How are you not going to have more of an equilibrium? You'll have more justice, more equality, more fairness, better world, but you're going to have more of an equilibrium.
What you'll have is companies finding a reason to stay in country and hire locally. I don't agree with that. Like, if you think about why Holden Australia or Ford Australia moved their plant to South Korea or to Taiwan, cheaper labour.
Yeah.
But if the labour in Taiwan can move to Melbourne, and people can move to Taiwan, the wage standards in that country aren't going to stay low for very long. They're going to rise. Or they're going to at least perhaps get to what you talk about with the equilibrium.
They'll be...
But what that means
average is going up for everybody. But
what that means is if people can leave that country, you can't keep labour enclosed by national borders. And therefore, there's no point in going there if the wages aren't going to be low. Look, so you wouldn't have companies going overseas. And this is actually classic kind of Marxist theory, that this is why unions need to internationalise when you have the international workers of the world kind of stuff, because they know that capital mobilised and they missed the boat. They tried.
Yeah, I don't think
multiple times because they wanted to create a movement that was going to be transnational.
Dude, I think that they didn't get it. I think that's insane in a way, because, half the world's capital can get together in a fucking conference hall, and the world's labor is 7 billion people. Like, how are they gonna get? How are they gonna get on the same page?
No, but you have union representatives. Like, there's ways to do it, and it's been tried at multiple internationals.
No, all I'm saying is it's infinitely easier at the capital level than it is at the labor level.
Of course,
infinitely easier. And
but of course,
and to say like labor missed their chance. What, without the communication era, they were all going to be on the same page all around the world. Like, nah, that was not a chance missed. That never could have happened.
No, but it's important to note that the laws are written so they can do that easier.
Yeah.
And we don't make it easy for people to travel. That's the point.
No, but
we make it easy for people to go across.
Going back to the EU, and I think you hit a nail on the head. I mean, there's a simpler, narrower term. EU's become a bastion for neoliberal policies. Neoliberal policies meaning that everything is for sale. everything can be bought, everything is monetized, becoming an asset. Capital is infinitely mobile, and people, to some extent, in the region, but not from around the world. So what you really have is, if capital is infinitely mobile, well, what if you are a wealth fund in Paris with, I don't know, like 100 billion euros? If you're going to invest in manufacturers, really, the German ones are better. Because they're marginally more profitable, they attract all the capital. This is capitalism. It literally looks at thousands of opportunities of making money and then directs 90% of the capital towards the top 10% of opportunities for making money.
Yes.
Automatically creating gigantic corporations and monopolies, which is what's been happening in Europe since it united into one giant neoliberal federated United States of Europe, or whatever and on top of that, which I think is a minor issue, are the sort of democratic injustices of being managed and having your laws and regulations written in Brussels when you're outside the country, which is an issue. But I think the biggest issue is European Union, this common market, created advantageous conditions for corporations, which on average are disadvantageous conditions for the people.
Well, the funny thing is, I think it's...
Because the median, the standard of living for the average person has gone up in Germany, and I really think it's like fucking nowhere else in Europe. I mean, it was going up in Ireland, it was going up in Italy, it was going up in Spain, it was going up in Portugal, but I mean, since the global financial crisis, the drop has been so drastic, and I didn't even mention Greece, that the average person, despite huge increases in all the economic indicators since the formation of the EU, the average person has lost their share has got a lower share of the wealth than at any point since the start of the European Common Market.
All right, so it's, yes, I think it's important, though, again, to ask why.
Neoliberal policies implemented on a wide scale.
Yes and no.
Ooh.
Yes
okay,
and no.
What else?
Yes and no. So there's a couple of things that I think I want to kind of address. So the first thing is standard of living has gone up for the EU citizens. Up to before a certain year, I think that's correct. United States of Europe, I want to address that. But I think the important part about this idea can be encompassed by a couple of points that you made into one. So let's have a look at what is the EU. What is the euro? The euro is not a United States of Europe. It's not the same. The reason it's not the same is because they have a common currency like the US does. Everyone uses the US dollar. But they're not actually the same country. They submitted to a central banking system that controlled their currencies, the euro. They all use the euro now. So that they couldn't deflate or inflate their currency because they can't do that with a regional currency. Just like Florida can't deflate or inflate the US dollar if it wants to be more competitive with Indiana.
Yeah.
It can't do that.
Yeah.
But what they didn't do was they didn't make the United States of Europe. They kind of kept their sovereign boundaries. The French remained France and the Germans remained Germans. But they all got to use the same currency and got to trade as a common market internally and with the outside world. The problem with that is that you have powerhouses like Germany who have much better production methods, much more academic infrastructure, a bigger population in terms of their academic and research infrastructures. They have economies of scale that other European countries can't match. You have them becoming the producer of Europe, the net exporter.
Yep.
And then everyone else becomes the net importer. And what happened, and this is just very broad stroke analysis of Greece for a minute, because, I've done some research, but not that much, is that Greece became a net importer and they stopped exporting. because it was cheaper to buy olive oil from X, Y, and Z, and cheaper to do this and this.
Yeah.
So they became tourist havens. And for people in Europe, it was great. Like if you were sitting in France and you wanted to go live in Greece, you could go and buy a house in Greece without a big deal, and you could go and study at their universities without a big deal. It wasn't a big thing. So if you're a European citizen, you had a European passport, you were mobile to a certain extent. Outside Europe, people from outside Europe were not mobile.
Yep.
But the problem with that is, and then the next question becomes, why didn't the Greeks, when the shit started to hit the fan, move away from Greece? If they could do that, which they can, they're mobile in Europe, why didn't they move away from Greece? Why didn't they just go to where the jobs or the money were? Why didn't they go to Germany?
No, they're not exactly competing on an even playing field when they're not natives in terms of the language.
Yes, but the funny thing is that they didn't do that because they still feel a tie to those countries. If you live in Victoria, you're more likely to move within Australia because you might not feel a massive tie to New South Wales. If you live in Indiana and you move to Florida, it's as much as it's difficult, you might not feel a big deal. But if you're moving country...
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely.
You're changing language, you're changing culture, you've got ties to your old country, there's a certain amount of nationalism that goes into that mindset. So what they didn't do...
There's some compatibilities, but you're right. I can move from Austria to Germany, Germany to Austria, you can go from Austria to Switzerland, or from Italy to Switzerland, or Switzerland to Italy. There's a certain porous nature of the borders and mixed race nature of borders of certain countries. But yeah, going from Greece to Germany is a big deal. Although going from Turkey to Germany is no big deal anymore because there is like 10 million Turkish people, 10 million in Germany, people with Turkish descent in Germany.
But the point we're getting at is that they didn't. So there's two schools of thought. One, it wasn't set up the right way the first time. They should have done a lot more to make it a United States of Europe rather than just the European region with all these countries internally. But people, like if you ask someone, would you give up your country to become a European citizen? People, I think, thought of themselves as European, but also thought of themselves as inherently French or inherently English or inherently, and this is where we get to the Brexit vote and the xenophobia and the nationalism that comes in, the kind of nativism. Now, the European structure is hard to explain in a few quick words, and we're running out of time in our podcast. But essentially, there are three bodies inside the European structure. The European Parliament is the one where the British elect members of Parliament to go and sit in the European Parliament, like our normal parliaments. Yep. But that body has no legislative authority and no economic authority.
It's the European Commission.
The European Commission and the ECB, the European Central Banking or something, I can't remember what. Yeah. They have the authority to make economic policy for the euro that governs every country. So again, if you're France, you can't deflate your currency because you're on the euro and you don't have control over it. And the parliamentary body is just an advisory council. So essentially the euro is run by technocrats. It's run by people appointed to administer a government that actually are not
elected by anyone.
Sorry?
They're not elected. It's hard to rationalize what they're
and they're not accountable to the countries in Europe. Just like the parliament. Like if you elect a member of parliament in the European Parliament, you would think they would go and vote on things, and that makes sense. And then the English would have their say based on their proportional representation inside the European Parliament, based on how many people they have, etc., etc. That's not the case. The European Parliament has no legislative properties. It just advises. They hold votes on things, but essentially they become advisory to the actual people who make the decisions. So the problem with the whole system was that it was non-representative, and it was not a United States of Europe. It was not actually a project that encompassed Europe as a nation. It just said we're a region and we have a certain Eurocentric view of things.
You can't exactly...
But you can maintain your nationalism while being European.
Yeah, in a sense, there is a union of opposites that was too much to maintain.
But this is what leads to
we're one country. We're not one country. And there was, people had expectations again of having a certain amount of say, sovereignty, representation. That was never really going to be possible. But there were it was essentially people were promised more by the European Union than it could deliver.
100%.
And I think fundamentally that the collapse in Europe is due to a logical conclusion in following, neoliberal, almost mainstream economics, by which corporations are supported over people.
Well, the funny thing is that there is an economic. So again, let's kind of ask why. So why do they follow neoliberal policies? Now, the ideology and the university and the various history behind neoliberalism aside for a minute, if you're the European Union and you want to act as this big trading bloc, which is the whole point. Like, the whole point is that Greece has no power to negotiate with the United States or even California for their products because they're the small fish in the big pond. And the American system, the American country is a far bigger fish. But the European system, that larger block of trading is massive. It ends up being 35% of the economy of the world on its own. So they then have the power to come to the table and go, this is what you've got to do to deal with us and every country in here. And this is what we're going to do and what we're going to expect.
But you're right. There is.
So there's an economic reason for it. But
you then mentioned the fact that when you have a currency that big, you're not as prone to currency manipulation as they were prior to the euro, where various European currencies were being inflated and crashed by the international markets.
Well, and by banks, banks like Goldman Sachs. But the funny thing is that this is the second argument against why the euro failed. The ECB, the European Central Bank, who doesn't like to inflate or deflate the currency based on what's happening internally to single countries in Europe, doesn't want to do that because they know that when they do that, they lose power in that negotiating system. So if your currency lessens in value versus the US dollar, that's a bad thing for the group. So you end up kind of sacrificing the minnows inside the euro, Greece, even Italy, which is not a minnow, or France, which is not a minnow, for the larger good, which is the European Central Bank does not, like the ECB never acted like the Federal Reserve does. When the American economy is in trouble, the Federal Reserve changes monetary policy, just like our Reserve Bank does, to accommodate international competition. So it says we're going to lower or increase the value of the Australian dollar by raising or controlling interest rates and inflation. That's how it works. So,
well, I don't look Australia.
Let's just say
these are a bit too complex. I'm just gonna go like what goes down in America and ECB and Australia are all different things. Australia doesn't actually print its currency backed by the Australian. It borrows money from international markets, which is what smaller countries do. ECB and the United States actually just expand the money supply.
No, but hang on.
Which is a completely different thing.
I'm going to stop you there. What I'm going to say is that the central banks of countries,
some countries, including Australian and American, is if they're having a problem in terms of competitive trade, they have instruments inside their toolbox that allow them to make Australia more competitive or less competitive. Yeah.
Which is why they raise or lower interest rates. Which is why they talk about monetary policy.
They can increase or lower the value of the Aussie dollar by doing stuff.
Exactly right. The ECB has never acted that way, and that's a big problem. So right. The European Central Bank never did that, and it has the power to, but never wanted to do that. Because it knows that when you do that, the European country loses value inherently. Because as soon as you start manipulating it, you start having that problem of, well, is it, it wants to be the new reserve-backed kind of currency.
Yeah.
It wants to be the new powerhouse, and it recognises that other currencies have tried that and failed, or there's one that's been there for a long time and it's starting to fall apart. So,
dude, I don't.
So what I'm getting at is that the reason they couldn't come to the rescue of Greece is because they didn't want to sacrifice the larger currency goals of the European Union.
I disagree.
For the small minnows inside the block. No, this is actually.
I disagree.
They could have bought Greece bonds, right? So the European Central Bank, just like the Federal Reserve Bank does, and the RBA does, is that they could have bought government bonds to alleviate the debt, to to put money back in the system.
No,
but they didn't do that.
No.
Yeah.
No. Listen. You're on this. You're wrong. First of all, Greece was in more debt than they could ever pay back. Buying Greek bonds is Greece getting into more debt. Like, imagine you are in $2 million of debt and you make $100,000 a year. You're not going to be able to pay it in your lifetime. And I go, well, I'll just loan you another $1 million and then you can cover all the interest. Like, that's what you're talking about by buying Greek bonds. That was never possible.
No. That's not actually how.
No, but
that is exactly the same.
When you sell bonds on the market, you're borrowing money.
Sonny, no, that's not how it works. Because you can't equate a household income or my income to the income of a country which can tax its people for its that's not how it works. I can't tax myself.
No, but Greece is in more debt. Okay, which of these things are you disputing?
That's neoliberal economics. That's what you said. You said, if I'm in debt and I'm too far in debt, I can't borrow my way out of debt. But that's not actually how it works, because countries can, A, they have an income based on a taxable citizenry. B, they have larger production facilities than any house or family does. It's not a good analogy. You can't. It's exactly what Joan Kerner did a couple of years ago in the Victorian economy. You can't equate Victoria's economy to a credit card debt.
Look,
it doesn't work that way.
Never mind the faulty analogy.
No,
here's the accurate reality that's not disputed by anybody.
Tell me.
Greece was in more debt than it could conceivably ever pay. Even when you have like Yanis Varoufakis talking about this, and I've watched and read a ton of his articles and interviews since he left the government, saying the only rational solution had nothing to do with Greece borrowing more money or any bailout package by which Greece continues to pay its debt to the European banks, not European countries, to various, mostly French banks, funnily enough.
Mm-hmm. German banks.
The two leading ones. The two key creditors to Greece that are in danger of failing if Greece defaulted on its debt were actually BNP Paribas and Société Générale. Now, I don't know how the whole debt breaks down, but the number one and two major French banks
large French,
would have failed. No German banks would have failed.
No,
so,
like there would have.
I don't know what the total amount of debt is, but basically the Greek bailout was the primary beneficiaries were the two French banks. But regardless, what he's saying is, no, debt default was the only way out. Even the ECB admitted it, but they said, nope, your credibility depends on you accepting this bailout deal. Now, in an open market, if you want to stay within the neoliberal framework that exists in Europe, you borrow money, everybody's got different interest rates, and people look at you and your ability to repay and your probability of going bankrupt before deciding what they're going to charge you as interest.
Yeah, I understand that.
Greece was in a position that nobody wanted to borrow money to Greece. Lend money to Greece. Even at 20% interest. So the idea that they could go into more debt, Greece as a country reached that limit. Now...
hang on, stop. Let me stop you there. That's where the premises are wrong. So Greece has a central bank, but it's not under the control of Greece. So when Australia goes into debt, we can borrow money off our own central bank. We can print more money or more currency. We can also borrow money on the markets, but we have the ability to go to our own central bank.
True.
Greece doesn't have that ability.
Yeah, I know.
But that's the point, is that the ECB never acted like our Reserve Bank does. It never said to Greece, who's a member of the Euro, we're your central bank and we will come into your rescue by giving you fluid money markets to allow you to people to buy stuff, to pay more taxes and then pay off the debt.
I understand your point now. I actually do. You're right. It could have gone down that way.
But it can't, because the Euro's not set up that way.
Well...
That's the point.
The
ECB never acted that way because it was never set up to do a Federal Reserve style system. It was never set up to be a central bank.
If America can give 0% interest money to all its banks, ECB could have given it to Greece, which would have kind of alleviated that problem.
No, but that's what I'm saying. It doesn't want to.
I agree. But the problem is, you have a system where, money is debt. money comes into existence. We've had the same system for thousands of years, actually. Just people with assets printing money and then demanding interest. And the amount of debt becomes infinitely larger than the amount of the actual money in people's bank accounts. Yes. And then you used to have in the Middle Ages the Jubilees, because it's mathematically impossible to carry on the system without cancelling all the debt. And, every 30, 40 years, they cancel all the debt.
Yeah.
Now, this is the system within which we operate. But instead of cancelling all the debt, you could have the creditor seize out all the assets of all the other guys and keep them in debt until they own literally everything. And this is the sort of neoliberal game that's been set up in Europe, going, actually, we know you can't pay, but this is what you're going to do. Rather than declare bankruptcy and then we deal with the fact that you're now bankrupt, no. We are going to get you to give even less to your people, take even more from them, give it all to us, including your islands, assets, rivers, lakes, waters, and fuck you. Now, with this notion of them receiving, all these countries that are in so much debt, receiving more loans from the European Central Bank, which could give them, that in itself, euro being not the reserve currency of the world, that in itself would, I believe, from what I understand, even from left-wing commentators, would have led to something like the Weimar Republic. Because there's simply too much debt that if it were to be all handled and paid off by another wave of cheap money without there being some type of a universal default, you would arrive at money needed to be, the rate at which it's loaned out. You'd arrive at negative interest rates. You'd arrive at bizarre economic conditions. So,
but hang on.
Even within the context of the game, as the rules are set up with central banks, the global system needed a debt jubilee.
Okay. Yes.
Different countries played off different ways.
Yes. Look, I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to say yes. I agree with you in principle that debt jubilee sounds great, and I actually would like that idea. But what I'm getting at is that's not the system we set up at Bretton Woods. The system that was set up by Keynes and his team in the Bretton Woods negotiations during and after World War II was a system where deficit spending was of benefit. And this is where you get left-centrist economists and you get far-left economists. Now, if you're a far-left economist, and I'm probably far-left and I study some economics, I think there's legitimacy in what you talk about debt jubilee, 100%. But I don't agree with the fact that you can't spend your way out of deficit. And you actually can. And the examples are numerous. Have a look at Europe after World War II. Have a look at America during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So the New Deal was him saying, we're so far in debt, but I'm going to print a shitload more money and I'm going to put people to work. They're going to create economic activity. They're going to buy stuff with their wages. They're going to pay me tax back. And I can then grow the pie out of debt. And that's actually what happened.
Listen.
But that's what happened.
You cannot. Let's be clear here. The reason why you could buy, you could go to the shopping in 1920 and spend $5 to fill up this much, and now you need to spend $150. You can't grow out of debt. Mathematics of it means that interest is constantly growing faster at a faster rate than it doesn't. Even if the people are, all the money's coming back to you, right? If I have $100 and I loan it to you, and then you pay me back, but with interest. If you were to pay back, if all the world's debt were to be paid back, there would be still trillions of dollars being owed and zero money in everybody's account.
You got to hang on, Sonny, stop. You got to understand. I'm not arguing that you can get out of debt. Because out of debt is not where countries need to be in this system. We're arguing different premises. Let me clarify the premise.
What I'm trying to explain here is that what you're saying is that with this notion of you have this much. Here, I'll also sort of do the visual graphic on the screen, right? You have this much, you owe that much. If you did this, you see what I mean? You create this much more debt and this much more money. You owe now 3 times more than you have. And then when the amount of money you have and the amount of money you owe both go up by the same amount, oh, now you have 5 and you owe 7. That's cool. Before you had 1 and you owed 3. That was completely out of control. Now that is deficit spending. That's fine. Even that has mathematical limitations because eventually, 100 years down the track, this is going to be $1 million mug. And it's okay if we can psychologically, it's nothing to it. We can psychologically adjust to there being $1 million mug. But I think once you do that too fast, if that doesn't take 100 years, if that takes 10 years, then the whole economy is built on trust. That trust evaporates, people raise panic, and you have to build a whole economic system from scratch, and so on.
Okay, yes, I've understood what your point is. There's a couple of points to address in that. 1, let's take 1 to 3 and 5 to 7.
Yeah.
So the amount of debt versus spending hasn't changed. It's still 2, right? What has changed?
The amount of assets versus debt. Yeah.
But the percentage of that
The
versus the whole
percentage
has
changed.
reduced.
Yes, drastically.
Right.
Yes.
So look at 1 to 3, look at 5 to 7, and then look at 30 to 32. What do you get? You get far less debt percentage-wise. That's deficit spending. Secondly, deficit spending has the benefit of the money multiplier, velocity of money stuff. So if you give a poor person a job building a road or sweeping the streets or planting trees in the park or weeding the public gardens, they're going to spend that money in a shop.
True.
The shop pays the wage. He's going to spend the money at another shop. Money multiplier, right? So this is the point that you can actually spend your way to debt. And the 1 to 3, 5 to 7 argument is what neoliberals use to not spend in.
No, neoliberals never use this argument, ever.
No, they actually do. What they say
1, 3, 5 to 7.
What they say is
actually
your debt that you accumulate now will have to be paid off by your grandkids. Oh my God, they're going to be in debt. Like there's some point where we get to zero balance again.
Yeah, it'll never happen. Ever.
So what you have to do is deficit spend. That's what you have to do. That's a neoliberal argument. It doesn't work.
No,
what you have to do is deficit spend. You have to say, you know what? Rather than constricting the economy to create more money to pay off debts.
I have no issue with deficit spending.
But that's my point. You can do it. It doesn't have a mathematical limit, is what I'm saying.
No, this is where I disagree. How? Because, let's say we have a sound economy with the amount of money. Imagine your wages are going up, but it's not perfectly linear. On average, prices go up 10% each week.
Yep.
And on average, even the wages are tracking the prices.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of chaotic. I'm just at an average. Sometimes they double. Sometimes they stay the same for a week. The point is the speed at which prices inflate, at which we grow the money supply and the debt, the speed at which the real money is catching up to the debt. Remember, that gap has to constantly grow forever. Even if you go from 1 to 3 to 5 to 7, in a decade, you are 5 to 10. And now you got to go to 15 and 20. No. The gap has to grow forever. No, it's mathematically certain.
Hang on, Sonny, stop.
Unless you have negative interest rates. Without negative interest rates, the gap growing forever is mathematically certain.
Again, that's not how it works. So let me explain why it doesn't work that way.
I know this stuff pretty well. I've read...
Because that's an idea of a zero-sum game. What you're giving me is the idea that economics is zero-sum. So there's a winner and a loser.
No, it's not philosophical. There is no zero-sum game, winner, loser. No. This is pure mathematics. There is money loaned at interest.
Sonny, let me finish. The equation never balances.
But I'm not saying that it does. I'm just saying the gap has to grow forever.
What you end up doing is reducing the debt to GDP ratios or the debt to population ratios. So your argument is that because of the way economics and mathematics works, because every person will naturally get more debt than they can spend, or there's a kind of a multiplier effect that says the 5 to 10 becomes 5 to 20, becomes 15 to 30, and there's kind of this larger... That's not how it works. The reason it doesn't work that way is because...
What do you mean it doesn't work that way? The prices of, A banana now costs 100 times more than 100 years ago. That's exactly because it works that way.
I'm not doubting that. What I'm doubting is the idea that that's something to do with just that and nothing else. So increased population has an effect on that. But don't forget, what we're talking about is, again, if I spend $1 and there's 10-cent tax on that, right? That dollar is not gone. It's not finished.
No, I'm saying...
So when I spend that $1 in a shop, and I pay 10 cents tax on that $1 because I earned it in the first place, right? I've got the $1, I've given 10 cents back to the government. That person gets $1, and he gives 10 cents back to the government. And that person spends this $1. This is $1 making its way around. $1 ends up being, I think economists have worked out to be 9 times 10 its actual value on the face, because it gets spent that many times before it loses its dissipation value completely. And that's the point. Economists who use those arguments don't factor in what's called the velocity of money or the multiplier effect. They just say $1 is $1, and it doesn't get any more value than that. It just stops. As soon as I have it and spend it, it's done. It doesn't have any other effect in the economy.
No.
And that's the fallacy. And that's the fallacy that creates the idea that because, when I said zero-sum game, what I meant was that inputs and outputs are negative, positive, or zero.
Yeah.
But that's not how it works. It's actually far more complicated than that when you look at the money multiplier effect. So because my $1 that I've earned or created or borrowed, so borrowed from the bank, ends up being worth $10, and there's more than $1 in tax that comes out of that $10, actually I can reduce my deficit by expanding the money supply. So let's say that I borrow $1 and I pay 10 cents tax on it. And that $1 has a multiplier effect without further borrowing, by the way, because the $1 is now spent into the economy, of 10 cents per time it's spent. I've actually paid back that original $1 in tax already. I've done that. That's said and done. And that's assuming that it's only spent 10 times.
Yeah.
That's the problem with your analysis.
No,
you forget the idea that you actually can spend. The $1 is worth more than just one spend.
I know, but every time it transfers accounts, people can loan out 90% of whatever is...
I'm not transferring. If I buy a guitar off you and you declare it on your income as an asset, you pay tax on the income you took from me, but the $1 isn't borrowed again. The $1's already borrowed into existence.
Yeah, if I have that $1 in my bank account, it is borrowed again because...
But hang on, it's not borrowed by you again. That $1...
It's borrowed by my bank.
It might be lent out by other people.
Yeah, lent out by the bank.
But it's not... It doesn't go further into the debt of the country. But this is where you actually can spend your way of deficit, and there's no limit to that spending, as long as the economic activity keeps functioning. Again, that's why people keep borrowing money into existence.
No.
Because that's how it works.
I don't think there's...
Otherwise, we'd be saturated in debt and nobody would have a positive trade balance.
Yeah, but...
Countries have positive trade balances all the time because we have more spending and more taxing going on than what we borrow, and we get back to an equilibrium between taxing and spending and borrowing. But as soon as that goes to the point where you can track the money supply, when you pull it in, you reduce that activity, and then your deficit goes out of control. That's actually economics. That's how it works.
You see, I don't, again, with this model, rather than, looking at monetary policy or what countries do and how countries tax people and deficit spending, I simply look at the mechanics in which it's created and how it travels through the system. You're right. The velocity of money is a factor. When $1 in a currency can act as 10 with all the transactions that are exchanged. But again, money's, 99% of the money supply is in bank accounts, and banks lend against whatever is in their accounts, and they lend, initially when they borrow from the central bank, they'll lend 10 times more. So they're making, the central bank gives the commercial bank $1 million, the bank lends out 10 million, and is now collecting $1 million a year in interest on the $1 million that it borrowed. And there's like $1 million in interest already owing on $1 billion that originally existed. But you're right. In between, they've made it sufficiently complex so that we cannot, within one conversation, without charts, figures, mathematics, ever convey it to a normal person on the other side. But the mathematical reality of the system that we have, you're right, spending your way from a big debt and then the government's borrowing more money because of debt, there is no limit to that in terms of healthy economic conditions. The limit to it is that inflation has crazier and crazier numerical figures to it. That's it. That's the only problem.
So let me address that point. Let's look at the current American situation. So quantitative easing, they've been injecting billions of dollars into the economy, and the value of the American dollar hasn't significantly changed. Now, why is that? Okay. Because with inflationary theory, with the theory you just said, which is if you print more money, the value of the money drops and its purchasing power decreases. Why hasn't that happened with the American money? Now, what you said before actually gets to the heart of the problem, is that what the value of the American dollar is based on is not the amount of dollars in the system. That's actually the economic fallacy we believe.
You're right.
So what is it?
But it's unique to the American dollar.
No.
It's pretty, look, there's still qualifying statements here. Two qualifying statements. Two things. First point, we're talking about the American dollar, which is there is no translational factor. Like if this kid can learn the alphabet, then that kid can learn the alphabet. The American dollar is nothing like any other currency in the world. It doesn't obey any of the same rules. The American dollar has, by the force of a gun, a number of the greatest assets in the world, like oil, all kinds of minerals, only sold in American dollars. To buy that, you need to buy the American dollar. So the demand for the American dollar is artificially huge. 10 times higher than it should be.
Sure.
Following any economic theory. And secondly, they gave it to banks. And what banks did with the money is completely different than if it was spent in the economy, if it was built the roads.
100%, I agree with you.
So all that happened is that these banks would have gone bankrupt, and all these assets would have been written off. They just said, hey, you're not going to go bankrupt.
Is this America? Or?
Yeah, this is America.
Right, yeah. Okay.
You have infinite credit lines at 0% interest, so you can never go bankrupt. And that's what they did to the banks.
Yep.
And,
I get that.
So that is not the same effect as putting money all across the economy. It's just like these banks, they call it the holes in the balance sheet. These banks had an amount of debt that was bigger than the amount of assets they had. Nobody knows how much debt because it was all so complicated.
Sure.
But all that they said is now these banks have infinite borrowing power, therefore none of them can even theoretically be broke. Sure. Ever. And all of a sudden people just pretended all that happened wasn't that there's all this new money circulating. All that really happened was that people just said, you know those broke banks, they're not really broke. Because no matter how big holes in the balance sheet they have, no matter how many liabilities they have, they can pay them all because they have an infinite supply of money at their fingertips. And that's it.
But Sonny, you're proving my point. My point to you is that the amount of money in the system, whether it be borrowed into existence or not, American dollars, had no effect on the inflationary value of that currency. The same applies to Australia, it applies to the euro. Why did it have no effect? So regardless of whether the American banks borrowed it and gave it to their citizens, which they didn't, to start businesses and shit, which is what they were meant to do.
Yeah.
Or they took it offshore to Brazil and played in the Brazilian money markets because they got better interest rates, which is what they did, right? Mm. Regardless if that happens, the debt was still accrued and money was still given on the balance sheets. The money supply was expanded exponentially during this period. It still is being expanded. But inflation hasn't hit. Why is that? Because it's nothing to do with the amount of money in the system. What it's to do with is trust.
Yeah. But...
So the funny thing is, if you're a money trader, you go where the currencies are trusted, which is why people flock to the euro 1 minute, and then they flock back to America. And those are the things that actually change the values of the currencies. It's nothing to do with the amount of money in the system. That's what we've been fed. Because, again, my example is the quantitative easing and is the fact that we borrow huge amounts of money every day. Huge amounts. Have a think for a minute. about the amount of people going into Australian banks in our small system compared to the US, right? Mm-hmm. Think about every day the amount of loans banks write that they don't have assets for. Mm. Fractional reserve banking means that they create money by creating a loan, and you pay it back with interest. The amount of money that people take on board with credit cards, loans, and everything else that we borrow money for would mean that the Australian currency right now, think about it, people are saturated in debt.
Dude, unfortunately, this is way too complex to boil down to a single thing. No, but to say that the amount of money in circulation has got nothing to do with the valuation is, I completely disagree with that, and I'll tell you why.
No, but I'm giving you an example. Let me finish the example.
I'll debunk that example.
Let me finish the example. The American system, let me use the American one. And you said it's different. It is, but it's not. So why didn't that amount of pumping into the system, zero interest rates, where the banks could ease their balance sheets and take it offshore, why didn't it change the value of the currency significantly? Well, why didn't the American system crash? Like Alex Jones says it does all the time.
Well, here's
because it's based not on the amount of money, it's based on trust. It's based on how much they think the American government can pay back their debts. Greece had the same problem. And what you said before, when you said Greece went for money in the markets, and people said, I'm not going to even loan you stuff at 20%, is because they don't trust that even the Greece inside the European Union, which is backed by the ECB, can pay its own debts off. No, but it's got nothing to do with the amount of euros in the system. It's all about trust.
Trust is a huge thing.
It's all about trust.
And
I'm putting myself on the line saying it's all about trust.
Well, here's the sort of grand scheme of things, right?
We have to wrap it up soon.
Every economic theory, if you're going to try to apply it to the United States, falls out the window. Every economic theory ever written. They can't go.
I don't think it does.
Wait a second. Do you think any country, USA can pay all its debts because the debts are in dollars and they print dollars. So there is no notion. And if a country says, we don't accept you just printing dollars to pay off debts by devaluing the dollar, we want assets, they'll go come and get them. Like, there is no, the relationship,
So let me summarize this. The American system has a unique ability to pay off its own debts in its own money because every other country has to buy American dollars before it pays off its own debts. Right. But that doesn't take it out of the law of economics completely. It just says that it has the most control over its economy. Sure.
Now,
but that doesn't.
Now let's look at Australia here, for example.
But we definitely.
Do you know, for example, 1 hour 46 minutes. All right. So, damn, we didn't touch on Sanders and the election, but
let's finish this point and then go.
Almost all the debt in Australia is linked to property, and when you think about what happens, when you loan someone $2 million to buy a house, there isn't $2 million in circulation. All that happens is that there's a $2 million hole in someone's bank account. And he's paying it at interest. Now, that interest is going to be 3 times more on average than the amount of money borrowed. Sure. That guy maybe gave someone $2 million, but now, and that $2 million has gone into some bank account. But what's happened at the same time right here is that because when you pay off the debts, the money gets extinguished. So for $2 million to go into his bank account here, at the same time on the other end, $6 million gets paid off and actually extinguished. So what you have with selling assets like houses is a much more sort of stable, not money supply expanding compared to borrowing to businesses, which you borrow to a business, they spend it, it goes to people's accounts, and then they go broke. Even if they had a really huge upside, they go broke. And that money stays in people's accounts. So it doesn't get extinguished by being paid back as often. And that has a much more inflationary effect than spending into borrowing, fixed assets like property.
Okay, so stop there. So, please, for a sec. So, the debt is extinguished.
Which means the money is extinguished from the money supply.
I agree with the first part of that statement. So, I've had a home loan. I've sold my house and paid off and my debt's been extinguished. But the money still exists in the banking system as... So you're talking about private debt and public debt.
No. I could write it on this board, man. All a bank has
Sonny, stop. Let me finish my point. There is public debt and private debt. The bank, when it loans me money, loans me money because the money's been borrowed into existence by me, but through the banking system, which is a public debt, and it's gone on to a private debt. I've extinguished my private debt, but that money that I borrowed in existence has gone back into the bank to be, in theory, reloaned or used as the fractional reserve to loan more money out. It hasn't left existence. My debt has left existence. But the money itself is like, it doesn't disappear. It keeps circulating. That's the point. You're missing the point about the fact that the money itself is separate. Money is debt. But in this system, they're not the same thing.
Right. Here's the thing. You owe, today, you have $1 million, and the bank is owed $1 million. They didn't have it to give it to you.
I agree with you. Yeah.
They didn't have it to give it to you. So when you pay it back, it disappears.
No. It doesn't. But this is my point. It doesn't disappear. It goes back into the bank to be used as their reserve to be loaned out again.
Well,
that's not how it works.
The point is,
and that's why that's the zero sum thinking that I'm talking about that you're doing, which is not correct. That's not how it works. The money stays in existence, even though it's borrowed into existence and it's made out of thin air because of fractional reserve. I get all that. I agree with all that. But it doesn't disappear because the debt is extinguished. That's not how it works. The money stays in existence because it's been borrowed into existence. It doesn't, like if you borrow $1, no matter how you borrow it, it's now in the system. It doesn't go away.
Yeah,
it doesn't vanish. The debts vanish based on my public debt, like my little balance sheet will go back to zero. But I am not a country. And I am not the money system. It's not how it works.
If you're a creditor and you don't actually have the assets, you're just putting numbers into people's accounts.
Yeah.
You can just, I loaned him $1 million, I gave it back. Now, what used to be an account that at $1 million is just now nothing because he gave it back. You can loan it to someone else next, but the point is, from their perspective, when people pay money back, assuming that another person the same day doesn't borrow the same amount of money from the bank, borrow the same amount of money, it is extinguished for that moment.
It's extinguished from my point of view.
No, it's from the whole system point of view.
It's not. It stays on the balance sheets.
It doesn't.
It does. It stays on the balance sheets. How do you think the banks have balance sheets?
Dude, their balance sheets...
The banks don't operate at a zero level. But look...
No. This is something I'm beyond...
What we need to do is make our next podcast about economics, and we'll do our research and come back and talk about it. But look, let's touch on a few more points because we should finish soon. We've been going for 2 hours. So, Bernie Sanders. He had to endorse Clinton. There are people who believe he's playing a chess game right now. Roosevelt endorsed his opponent before he took the nomination in 1933. So it's important to know there might be other pieces to come down on that. Secondly, he always said he was going to.
I hope against hope, but...
So do I. But he always said he was going to, and you can't fault him on keeping to his word.
I think this is what I think. Hillary Clinton... every single person that's ever done what Hillary Clinton has done with handling of confidential information that we're aware of, I'm sure that there are people has gone to jail.
She got off because she was powerful. Totally agree.
Nobody's ever been given that exemption in the history of the country. Yes. I'm sure that people have been given that exemption without the public knowing, but anyone who has publicly grossly mishandled confidential information without being president, they get pardons. They get pardoned. Presidents actually get pardoned for that. But every other person that came out about has ended up in jail. They haven't found one example of anybody that's been pardoned for that. FBI is just going, well, poof. They even said she did it all, but we're not going to charge her. So you have complete evidence of gross negligence and recklessness in positions
at the very least.
And Sanders says, I don't want to talk about your damn emails, which to me is like Sanders doesn't want to win. Like, if on the weekend my opponent is driving out fucking crashing cars, risking people's lives, and then you say, well, probably nobody died. Like,
no, but hang on. So let me stop you there. I agree with you, but I think Sanders did not want to be a spoiler. That's why he ran in the Democratic Party. He wants to not elect a Republican. That's his goal. There's no ego involved. He doesn't want to win for winning's sake. He just wants to not elect a Republican because he knows that if you do, or if they do, they're going off the cliff. And that's what he's worried about. And that's why he endorsed it. And that's why he didn't want to talk about the emails. He wanted to focus on the issues. And that's been his game all along. He said, it's not about me. It's about A, not electing a Republican, and B, a movement I'm starting. And
can I just also...
I think he's accomplished that. I hope.
I don't really think...
I still am a big Sanders guy, you know that.
I lost all respect for him. I think he's, for want of a better word, this is going to sound horrible, but I think he's a pussy. Frankly, I would understand maybe he wanted to say this. I'm sure the feminists
in the room had a problem with that.
No, if your opponent, a political opponent, if you stand for something and you're running against a criminal warmonger, there is no end to scandals with Hillary Clinton. I don't want to get through it because I won't finish for 20 minutes. And if you don't call a criminal, if you don't have the balls to say that...
But don't forget, he was bound by the DNC. He had to submit to various rules. He had to go into agreements. He had to use their databases. I agree with you because I'm a Sanders guy and I don't like Clinton either. But that's not you can't take away from what he had to go through to get to the point he did.
And finally, I'd like to address the whole notion of thinking of the greater good. Frankly, I'm petrified of both. Trump has mobilized a bunch of right-wing fascists across the country, like racist people. And it's scary because they come to his rallies in tens of thousands and they chant, build a wall and kick out the Mexicans, 12 million of the undocumented, completely bizarre shit. And that's scary. That's frankly scary. But what you have is America on the brink of collapse because we have had since Reagan an uninterrupted 30-year wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. And one of the most strongest advocates of this behind the scenes, of this transfer is Hillary Clinton. And frankly, if you look at the economic front and if you look at what Trump is saying, he is actually more economically, at least in the rhetoric, left-wing than even Hillary Clinton. And then if you look at all the wars that America is potentially going to get into, frankly, Hillary Clinton is more anti-Russian, more anti-Iran than even Trump. But I don't even know what Trump's stances are. He changes his stance every 5 minutes. I don't even know what the fuck he's are. But frankly, I think Hillary can drive... If she's president for something like 8 years, she's going to drive that country into the ground. The economic disparity is going to be so huge, there's going to be a social revolution, to which the most rational response is a third world war or some kind of war or an invasion on Iran, which she's more down with than 9 out of 10 people who could be elected as president. So Hillary's pretty fucking scary for me. And
can I just
Trump, the only if what Trump is saying that he's cool with Putin, and that he wants to implement protectionist policies to keep American companies hiring American workers, if he actually says yes on that, he says he's less harmful than Clinton. I don't believe that he's going to say yes to that. I believe he's in bed with the same powers, and his memory's too shit to stick to the fucking party line. But at the end of the day, he will obey the party line, and he'll have a fascist movement behind it. But to me, it's identical. Most likely. You have a horrible person with a fascist movement and a horrible person without a fascist movement. And that's the only reason why sort of the hordes of really right-wing people behind Trump is the only reason I'm marginally more scared of Trump. But I think Hillary is more likely to get a war passed through the institutions of America than Trump is, because everybody thinks he's an idiot.
So the funny thing is, I think you're on the money there. There was a lot of points. But what we're up against is a neoliberal, socially progressive warhawk versus a neo-fascist right-wing corporatist. And if I have to choose the wolves or the foxes, it's a big call. But from Sanders' point of view, he went, I'd rather a socially progressive person who's giving some lip service and doing some things, at least continuing Obama's policies, which hasn't been great, but they've been better than anything Trump or Bush have ever done.
Dude, we're going to look back on Obama and go like, he was great. And I think he was 5% of what he could have been. He was horrible and average.
You might be right, but
we're probably going to look back on Obama.
The point I'm making is a continuation of his policies from the neo-fascist, slightly more hawkish person than Clinton versus pro-corporatist, random, who knows what he's going to do, Trump. You know, Sanders went, I'm going to go with Clinton. And that's what he did. But
my view, just my view on it. It was that Trump is such a joke and Hillary is such a criminal that if Sanders, on even on the expense of people hating him and Democrats electing someone else, if Sanders knocked out Hillary Clinton, somebody else would have knocked out Trump. I mean, I think...
Well, this isn't done yet. Jill Stein is still in the race. The Senate supporters are getting behind her.
I think Trump is so horrible that if Democrats have a really weak candidate, and hopefully Hillary is going to be that weak candidate, that may be the third. But again, you have the voting machine, so it's rigged in that regard.
So, and again, look, I want to finish it up there with just a quick mention of stuff that came to my mind through fairies and roses bringing them to me at random during the conversation. Probably a note about privilege, because we've talked a lot about a lot of things here: Australian election, US election, Brexit, right and left wing stuff. We talk about it from a very privileged position, obviously, because we're white, middle-aged men in a country that supports us and has fairly strong welfare state privileges, etc., and we tend to nativize that. So it's important to know that when we talk about refugees and happenings in Europe and America, we do it from a position where we can sit in front of our expensive computers and microphones and then go out to dinner and have a couple of beers afterwards, and our world is not radically changed by that. So it's important, I think, to think about those ideals when you make those kind of decisions. Now, the reason we're so pro-refugee in terms of we acknowledge they exist and we acknowledge there should be something done about them in a humane way is because we're kind of consciously and unconsciously admitting our privilege. We're kind of saying, we have a better position that people should be envious of when you look at their positions, and therefore they want to come and have what we've got, and we should be extending our arm a little bit to help with that. So I think it's important to kind of keep those contexts in mind, because we sit here and we're not really affected by the American election these few years. Even electing Malcolm Turnbull's not going to affect us too much for 4 years until he gets thrown out finally. So
you're right. There is
for us, there's kind of a disconnected reality here, and we've got to think about those things when we make those choices. But the interesting part about that is the right-wing politics often doesn't. The right-wing politics says, no, I'm not privileged. I'm just who I am, and I got here on my own. And
fuck off.
and other people didn't get my chances, but that's screw them. They're not entitled to the same chance. So it's important to kind of think about those things.
I want to comment on that, and I'd say, look, frankly, the disparity in opportunities between people like us and people in the third world, it is a luxury to think about what we think about, what we talk about. It is a luxury. At the same time, though, I think there's the overall stress on something like privilege on the left, I think, has gone a bit too far. I think everything in any game, any system, any country, any political economy, everything's rigged to some extent. Everything is rigged to some extent. It's just, even in nature. The point is, because everything is rigged, not everything is equally important. Some things are much more rigged than others. And I think that, with there being an observable injustice in every relationship, there always being a power differential with everything, we shouldn't use that. That can be used to distract you from where the biggest power differentials that exist and the ones that you can change are.
Look, the funny thing is, I think that I went to see John Pilger speak at one of the last Marxist festivals a couple of years ago now, and it was when the gay marriage thing was really hitting its strides. And he got up, and, he's a lefty guy, and he's pretty angry, and he's good at telling it like it is, and he's good at saying, and these people are shit, and Tony Blair was a criminal, and you should have questioned him, you bastards in the media, and we might not have invaded Iraq, and it's your fault, and you could take responsibility for it. And he's, good at saying, but this guy's dodgy, And he said, gay marriage is important. But there are other things that we really should be like. This becomes as important as it is. It becomes the distraction because
couldn't agree more.
The other things
I couldn't.
So I think there's an element there, but it doesn't mean you can discredit.
No, not to discredit. Absolutely not. It's simply, like a deeper social analysis. You realize that, like, when you have time to think about it, when you have a whole field of social sciences, you do realize practically every type of relationship we have is being rigged in some direction. But people can very easily, with the sort of, global warming, gay marriage, the churches and tax exemption. There's 100 hot button issues where something unjust is going on, where people can get inflamed, and the biggest injustices in the world are purely economic. The biggest, most rigged thing is an economic system that gives so much to very few people, fuck all to billions. And maybe, just maybe, in the system in which we live, 5% of people are given something like a fair shake that are somewhere in the middle, living in countries like us.
You know what you need? An arts degree. We're gonna wrap it up there.
Sweet. All right, take care, y'all. 2 hours, 5 minutes.
Okay.
Hello and welcome. This is Zeitgeist Melbourne Radio, a show, in the series. We haven't done one in a while, but there's a whole lot waiting to come out of numerous discussions we've had on current events and ongoing issues. So, I'm Sonny, that's Craig. We're two of the regulars at meetups. At least I try to be. Craig's regular.
I eat on my brain in the morning. I'm very regular.
So, Craig, we have a list. There's a plan of the 4-point. This is our platform.
It's that 4-point plan.
I can't read it. You can. But yes, we're here to discuss several major potentially globe-changing events, starting with the U.S. election.
No, the Oz election.
We want to start with the Oz election.
Start with the Oz election.
Okay.
So we should mention that we're part of the Zeitgeist Melbourne group, and you should watch the Zeitgeist movie series, 1, 2, and moving forward, or the original addendum and moving forward. They're available online, and we subscribe to those kind of ideals put forward in moving forward, and we like to talk about things from a geopolitical, economic, and Zeitgeistian stance. So we're going to start with the Oz election. Interesting election. Very interesting election. So just to wrap up, people who might not know, maybe from around the world, the Conservative Party had a big lead on what is considered our left. Before the election, they were in front by 25 seats or something. The Liberal National Coalition had a 25-seat jump on the Labor Party and the minor parties. There's been a lot of dissatisfaction with the previous leader of the Liberal National Coalition, a guy called Tony Abbott, and people, including on the political left and even mainstream and non-political left, thought that Malcolm Turnbull would be the new guy who's leading the party, who took control in the coup, would be a better option because he came out pro-climate change, pro-gay marriage at one point. Very rare for a Conservative politician.
So just to summarize, we have a very standard sort of following neoliberal economic model right-wing party that campaigns on the great threat of refugees, a few thousand that come to Australia in a year. They're the first major threat, the second major threat in this country, according to they're called liberal. They're the opposite of liberal, I think.
If the Australians have it backwards, it's important to note that when we talk about the Liberal Party, it's big L liberal.
Yeah.
Which actually means our Conservatives, more like the Republicans and the Tories.
It's like the Ministry of Truth.
And the Democrats or the...
It's an ode to George Orwell.
Yeah.
We're the Liberal Party. So they are basically, pro-status quo hasn't changed and something radical has happened. So what I'm saying, if there's two major parties in power, an election which results in one of them winning is something where we can all accept. Like, generally speaking, that's what we expect.
Yeah, but we can't accept the insurgent candidate or a different party.
Exactly. And if, in a way, it's almost a double insurance policy that one day, if an insurgent candidate does win, they can blame it on the voting machines that are electronic. But if the, status quo continues to win, then
it's validated.
It's validated.
Well, the funny thing is, I think you were touching on the next point, which is that the people that advocated for e-voting were the Labor and Liberal Party, the two major parties in Australia. And the Conservative
guys,
right and the less Conservative
right. For those of you not in Australia, I imagine 90% of you will be, but there is no major difference between these two parties. I mean, Australia's, in a way, one positive thing is that historically there has hardly ever been any major shift due to an election. We've had things like GST and Medicare introduced, and this was all revolutionary in the Keating and what's the name of the Hawke and Keating governments in the.
What are you referring to?
Like major changes in terms of the way this country's run.
I think that would probably be from Menzies and Whitlam, and then Keating and Hawke continued some of that, yeah.
Okay. So, I'm not that familiar with Australian history, but you can kind of, in the last 50 years, name 3 or 4 things, like GST, like Medicare, that have had an impact on our lives that we felt.
And free education at one point during the Whitlam years, yeah. Like, there's definitely stuff that's been... Look...
But... with the late,
yeah.
What major shift, other than the NBN, that's the biggest thing I can think of, is the NBN.
Well, this is the funny thing.
One party would do and the other wouldn't.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you here because I think the two parties are very aligned. They're very centrist right parties, and one is slightly further right than the other, and that's what we have. I don't doubt it. But it also mattered because the long-term project of the Conservatives is, like, if you look at documents and statements from multiple Conservative governments and leaders in the last 20 years, their goal has been to dismantle universal healthcare, our universal healthcare system, to deregulate university fees because they want to corporatise or privatise the structures. So while I agree that the Labor Party is not a left party anymore, it's not truly worker representative. They do, it's kind of, and I'm going to come back to Clinton here for a minute. She is more progressive on a lot of issues than Trump. And the same with the Labor Party and Liberals. They are further left. And you have to recognise that in terms of at least holding the line for things like universal healthcare and regulated university fees. And the Liberal Party came out and said we have to go to e-voting. Now, that's quite worrying for me, given what's happened in the American election.
Look, there can be there's been an analysis, for example, with Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton, right? He's been consistently trailing the actual votes have consistently trailed the exit polls by up to 15%, above 5 every single time. So that's never happened in any election ever covered in history in any Western country where, we consider there to be fair elections. There's never been such a consistent and wide discrepancy between exit polling and the final results.
I'm just going to pause you there for a minute. So that's completely correct. And the funny thing is that the US State Department uses exit polls from elections as a guide to get a general feel for if the elections are fair. And if they don't feel they're fair, they intervene or they question it. And the percentage they use is 2%.
Right.
So if you're holding an election in Venezuela or South Africa or some Argentinian country where they're monitoring you and your exit polls are more than 2% out of your counted vote, the American State Department will try and intervene or will question the election or will call you illegitimate.
OSCE, International Election Observer.
But some of their polls from Hillary versus Sanders, which is the primary election in the Democratic race, have been up to 15 points out, which is a huge discrepancy. And there was a Stanford study that said Hillary did better and exit polls were more out in states with no accountable paper record of the electronic voting. So where you were more likely to cheat, Hillary did way better. when you were less likely to cheat, when there were easily verifiable paper printout results of the election, there was, in theory, what the Stanford study is saying is less fraud. So clearly, e-voting has its problems. If we went that way, there would have to be huge checks and balances.
You know, you've got to realize how much is at stake when, you know, you're having an election.
Mm.
We're talking about probably hundreds of billions of dollars. Like that election in America influences 1 billion people in the world and every single major corporation around the planet. So like you have so many powerful stakeholders that want one candidate over another.
Mm-hmm.
So many reasons to rig it.
Yep.
And this can be done covertly. You don't need, like, I presume if they're going to collate these results from all these election machines, those machines are going to have IP addresses. They're going to send data, at least.
Mm-hmm.
But everything that sends data more or less also receives data, and everything that sends and receives data can be hacked by hackers. And, I mean, if you want a guarantee that some corporate, anti-worker, anti-human, against whatever, any type of diversity, refugees, gay people, the general sort of right-wing conservative trend. And if anybody from the outside observers, anybody that's got a keen political eye, whether we're to pick one person from the Liberal Party, that, you know, he's not too bad, it would have been Malcolm Turnbull.
Yeah, because he came out, you know, for things like gay marriage and climate change, or at least he believed...
He was one of the greatest anti-monarchy people in Australia. He was pro-Australia becoming a republic.
Well, the funny thing is, I think people liked him because he had this moment where he crossed the floor.
Yeah.
So what that means in electoral politics in Australia is we actually sit on different sides in the parliament. I think they do that in a lot of countries, actually. And instead of voting with the party... I can't remember whether it was climate change or gay marriage, or I think it was climate change or the carbon tax. He literally crossed the floor. He went over and voted with the Labor Party, and it was quite a groundbreaking moment. And people thought, "Wow, this guy's really different, and maybe he's a bit more our speed, and he's not X, Y, and Z." He got control of the Liberal Party from the previous heavily conservative, religious, right-wing nutter, dare I say it, and.
But then just proceeded to carry on the exact same policies with the same vigor. I mean,
yes.
Completely abandoned whatever principles he had as an individual. So, like, you can't be an individual as a party member, but you cannot be an individual as a party leader. He's just literally embodying their platform, which is kind of sad and embarrassing. But I'll say one very good thing about our election. Evidently, I truly think that it was a fair election. Unlike America, we don't have voting machines that...
they're talking about it.
You know, we don't...
Did you see the article about that?
No, I didn't.
No, sorry, just interject there. They're talking about that now. So, again, we need to recap the elections. So the Conservatives were 25 seats in front. They had a clear majority, Labor or our political left, which is very centrist. Compared to actual politics.
It's only to the left of the right-wing party.
Yes.
That's the sense in which they're left.
Most definitely.
In most European countries, they would be the right-wing party. Like, it would be
they'd
exactly
be conservative
the same.
centrist, yeah.
Yeah.
But, they were 25 seats behind, and they were completely decimated, the Labor Party, last election. And they came back with a screaming force this time. They won 12 of those seats back, and the Liberal National Coalition, the aforementioned Conservative Party, has attained what looks like the slimmest of majorities to govern. It's still actually potentially a hung parliament, but at the moment it looks like they're going to get just over the line. So they were decimated and Labor have come back. But what I was getting at before was they're thinking about going electronic. So there was this big hoo-ha.
Oh, hell no.
There was this big hoo-ha about the fact that it's been 2 weeks since the election and we haven't got a clear result yet. We're still waiting on votes to be counted manually. Paper votes, because we do paper voting here. And both the Labor
thing actually exists, like a record of something that actually happened. For instance, if you're creating a footage of an event, you're going to have it on a physical copy that cannot be edited, stored somewhere. But data from these machines, I mean, the only reason, we think our bank accounts are safe is because there's not enough money in those bank accounts. If you just follow something like credit card fraud, banks have endless budgets to prevent bank fraud and credit card fraud. And it happens at a tune of multiple billions of dollars a year. Mm-hmm. So the most secure systems for information, for money in accounts, aren't actually totally secure. Bitcoin, which is the most heavily encrypted thing we've ever come up with, before a number of scandals, they thought that nobody can steal your Bitcoins. It's theoretically impossible, mathematically certain. Simply digital data and information in terms of digital data is corruptible, modifiable. It's not inherently safe. You want to have normal, safe elections you should just vote on paper. End of story. No election held by e-voting can actually guarantee that those were the actual results.
And legitimate. But the interesting thing for me is why it's a problem. So if we think for a minute about elections and about the amount of time and effort it goes into them, it's almost a kind of an instant gratification thing. Like, we want to know immediately who won. And because we want to know immediately who won, because the country doesn't need to be in uncertainty, whatever that means.
The last winners are still in charge until we know. It's not exactly what's the big deal
exactly
with
right.
that?
But because we need to know, because the argument runs down the idea that we need to know straight away, we're kind of willing to sacrifice that legitimacy of proper paper votes you can see and verify and count. And I think that's going to require a change on our point of view. We have to say, actually, you know what? We're okay with the uncertainty for a month.
Yeah.
Leave the last guy in power for a month until we know what's going on. Because I'd rather, and I think it's better, to rather have that uncertainty for a month than have someone still in power who's been in power for 3 years anyway, to make sure the paper votes can be counted. Because that way you're going to get a lot less, the likelihood of fraud is a lot less. There's been some scandals in the AEC. There's been 4 or 5.
Let me just ask you, so what do you think would happen?
Sure.
If in America, I don't know, there's an election and Jill Stein wins by a landslide, there would be FBI investigations, right, left, center. They'd find some fraud, somebody who cheated for Jill Stein on some machine. The establishment candidates, people, when you look at reality shifts, it's much easier to sell that the